All right. Thank you guys for joining me today. As you can see, I've got the comment section open, so hopefully no technical difficulties. But yeah, I've got a really interesting topic that I want to get into. So with that said, let's dive into it. We're at an extremely critical juncture in the NFL offseason as the free agent period starts next week and the new league year cycle begins as well. So even though it's the offseason and the Super Bowl ended a few weeks ago, it is a pretty exciting time in the NFL. And I figured this is the perfect time to stop and look around and scan the current landscape of the NFL. So, as you all can see from the description, we're talking about what it takes to win in the modern day NFL, to get to big time playoff games, even the Super Bowl, and then what it takes to win the Super Bowl. So, we're going to use about 4 or 5 teams in our case study. Let's call it that. And of course, those being the teams that have recently made it to the Super Bowl, obviously the Chiefs, the 49ers, the Eagles, the Bengals, and Rams before that. But more specifically, the Chiefs. So I want to go back 2 years ago, a little bit of a history lesson, to this time 2 years ago, dating back to about a month after the Bengals and the Rams played for Super Bowl 56. And there were some big-time splashy moves during the free agency period and shortly after that offseason, especially with some trades, Devontae Adams going from the Packers to the Raiders, things of that nature. And if we start with the Chiefs, they ended up trading Tyreek Hill, who is arguably the most impactful receiver in the NFL, in my opinion. Now, since then, the Chiefs have obviously won Super Bowls without him, so that might raise the question or be reactionary to, maybe having an elite wide receiver one isn't essential for winning a Super Bowl or being a contender or giving yourself even a chance to win a Super Bowl. But in that same offseason, the Chiefs' future opponent for the Super Bowl 2 years ago was the Philadelphia Eagles, and they did the exact opposite. They traded for a bona fide elite wide receiver one in A.J. Brown. So when you take everything into consideration, a big reason the Eagles were able to trade for A.J. Brown is because they had not given Jalen Hurts his extension yet. And a big reason the Chiefs had to trade Tyreek Hill was because they had already paid Patrick Mahomes 2 off seasons ago. So all in all, in terms of the wide receiver department, the 2 teams that eventually met in the Super Bowl that year, they did it completely opposite ways. One traded a tier 1 receiver, one traded for a tier 1 receiver. So that's not one of the ingredients. You can do it both ways. You can have a great receiving core, or you can have an average at best receiving core with a great quarterback that can elevate their play, if you will. So let's look at the other side of the coin from those trades. The draft capital that the Chiefs got from the Dolphins, or the draft capital that the Eagles lost to the Titans. And this also turned out to be a bit of a non-factor. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the actual factors that make a Super Bowl contender in a minute. But, the Chiefs used that Dolphins first-round pick on a corner who turns out to be one of the better slot corners in the NFL now in Trent McDuffie. And the Eagles lost draft capital. They only had 5 picks in that year's draft. So, again, a bit of a non-factor. So what gives? You may be thinking, what are the similarities between the two? And even this past year's Super Bowl runner-up, the San Francisco 49ers. And I went back and I looked at the individual player cap hits for each team leading into their Super Bowl run. And that's where I found the common threads, if you will. And between the Chiefs, the Eagles, and the 49ers in the past 2 years, they are all paying big money to known commodities on both sides of the line of scrimmage. Now, that's not to say that other players at other positions can't have an enormous impact. It just means if you're a general manager, where are you spending your money? That's the way I would put it. So obviously, you still need to have close to complete rosters. And you can't have many holes at other positions. The Chiefs had great defensive backs and great linebackers. The Eagles had that star-studded receiving core with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But it's certainly a good starting point. Where you're putting your money into the line of scrimmage, that matters, especially experienced, even veteran players along the line of scrimmage. That was the other thing I noticed. Not a lot of young guys coming in from the draft and having a huge impact on the line of scrimmage for contending teams. It's a lot of Jason Kelsey, Lane Johnson, Chris Jones, Orlando Brown for the Chiefs. So now, even going back to the Bengals-Rams Super Bowl, ultimately Aaron Donald made the play of the game against the Bengals below average offensive line. So I've made my point there. So it's definitely a starting point. And then the next ingredient we have to look at is obviously the quarterback position, but more importantly, how much is this player and or position being supported? And the common thread there, again, I noted this yesterday in my episode, was elite level coaching. I mean, you've obviously got Andy Reid. And then for the Eagles, you had Shane Steichen. Look at what he did with the Colts this year, with Anthony Richardson going down and then Gardner Minshew nearly making the playoffs. So when you've got that elite play caller, that elite offensive mind, it just helps tremendously. So I would say the last ingredient is obviously hitting on draft picks. Now, the interesting thing is, what positions would you draft early in drafts or later in drafts? And although I said that the big money goes to the guys on the line of scrimmage, you could make an argument that there's no problem with drafting receivers and or defensive backs. As we saw with the Chiefs, and as I mentioned earlier, they had studs on the back end of their defense that are very young, even linebackers as well. So with all that said, the next part, as I put in the description, is really projecting what teams could be in position to have these ingredients to make for a contender this year in the upcoming 2024 football season. And I think it's fair to start with the Bills, since they came closest to beating the Chiefs in the AFC in last year's postseason. And they've played them in the playoffs 3 out of the past 4 years. So, they are paying their quarterback. I would say the quarterback is worth the pay in Josh Allen, and he's got great support with a really good play caller in Joe Brady. They've got good weapons, but they could bolster their receiving core behind Stephon Diggs and then a questionable offensive line. Now, the other ingredient that I'm looking at is they only have 2 of their top 6 cap hits being players along the line of scrimmage. Now, as some of you may have seen, they made a bunch of cuts yesterday, so there's a chance that they can go into this free agency period and grab impactful players along the line of scrimmage to really put themselves in position. So the offseason's not done, but I had to consider the Bills since they're consistently in the postseason. They've got the high-level quarterback, and now, in my opinion, a high-level play caller. The next team I'll go to is the Bengals, since they were the last team to beat the Chiefs in the postseason. And when considering everything I laid out in the episode, the quarterback and how much support the quarterback has, how much investment there is in terms of paying those guys on the line of scrimmage, and then elite coaching as well, I think the Bengals are in line to beat the Chiefs more so than any other team. And, obviously when you look at Joe Burrow, when you look at the support from Zach Taylor, I think he's a really good play caller. The upgraded offensive line, and then as an example, they were able to draft those wide receivers, Jamar Chase. They obviously franchise tagged T. Higgins. So that's an example of we're investing in the offensive line with guys like Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard, or the line of scrimmage, if you will. Those are defensive guys. And then they actually have Orlando Brown at left tackle. They're investing in the line of scrimmage and then drafting receivers. So the money has to go somewhere, and then you've got to get cheap somewhere too. The next team I would put here is the Ravens, since they just played in the AFC Championship game. They are paying the quarterback, and the quarterback has support with a good play caller in Todd Monken. I would say Lamar Jackson is close to being worth his price, but needs to have better postseason runs, obviously. And 2 of their top 4 cap hits come along the line of scrimmage, so that's a good sign. Again, work to be done there. Ideally, they sign 1 or 2 high-impact players along the line of scrimmage. And then I've got 2 more teams that I want to point out. I didn't go into the NFC because it's really just the Eagles, 49ers, Lions, Packers, maybe the Rams, teams like that. But the other teams in the AFC I'm looking at would be the Texans. I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Here we go. The quarterback is not getting paid huge money yet, and he showed lots of promise in his first year. They have good young players on the cheap in the secondary, like Jalen Petrie, Derek Stingley. They have a lot of ingredients. They just drafted Will Anderson on the edge. So they also have 3 of their top 5 cap hits are offensive linemen, defensive linemen. So that's another team. And then my last team in the AFC, a bit of a homer pick, is the Jaguars. Let's not forget, they're just a year removed from winning a playoff game, and their playoff loss in that year was to the eventual Super Bowl champs. So similar to the Texans, they're not yet paying the quarterback, but they've got a very talented quarterback who's got the support with Coach Doug Peterson and good weapons. We'll see what happens with Calvin Ridley. And then they're also hitting that 3 of 5 top cap hit players being on the line of scrimmage. So those are the teams I have. And all in all, one of my favorite aspects of football and the NFL in general is team building and roster construction. And considering everything I've laid out today, to me, there's really 2 paths you can take when it comes to building a team. And the 2 paths center around either 1, you're paying the quarterback big money, or 2, you're not paying the quarterback big money yet. And to me, if you are paying the quarterback big money and he's worth that money, then obviously the investment in the line of scrimmage and then ultimately the defense as well. That's what we've seen from the Chiefs. With Nick Bolton, Trent McDuffie, they've invested draft picks in that defense, and they've had a mediocre at best receiving core. So it is yet to be seen if a quarterback can elevate the level of play of the receivers like Patrick Mahomes has, but I think it's certainly possible. And then the other way, if you've got a quarterback on the cheap and you do have those investments in the line of scrimmage, I think you get the weapons to elevate the play of the quarterback. So as far as the draft goes, I would say, again, there's a lot of ways to get it done in the draft. And you could even make a case that drafting offensive line and defensive linemen later in the draft could be better as opposed to getting them early, because you'd rather just pay that known commodity on the line of scrimmage. We've got some big names coming up in free agency like Christian Wilkins, Danielle Hunter. I want to see where those guys land. Because, again, when you look at these teams that have won the Super Bowl or gotten to the Super Bowl or have been close, when you consider them contenders, that's where the money's going to those positions. So I want to get to the comments here. Yeah, I agree. A Joe Brady team will end up in the Super Bowl. At some point, it's got to happen, right? Little LSU shout out. To contend for a Super Bowl, above average O-line play, good to great QB play, and depth on defense. Absolutely. That's what we've seen in the past couple of years. Above average O-line play is paramount. And that's what I've come to learn, because I get a little happy and high on the receivers and the D-backs and the flashy positions. But, after doing the research today, you have to have those guys up front, and that's where the money should be going. And yes, a Joe Burrow team will surely wind up in a Super Bowl at some point. I agree. But yeah, that is going to do it for today. Now, I want to preview what the channel is going to look like next week as we get closer and closer to the NFL free agency period. Obviously, March Madness, like I mentioned. And I also haven't gotten into the NFL draft yet. Don't worry, I'm not forgetting about that. I definitely want to get to talking about specifically these quarterbacks. And, I've got a bunch of different context for the order in which the quarterback should be drafted, based off of strictly high-end potential, based off of pro readiness, things like that. So I'm going to create a few lists talking about the quarterbacks in the next year's draft class and maybe where they'll land and where they should land, things of that nature. And then obviously we've got the NCAA basketball conference tournaments coming up next week. So that'll be fun to listen to and watch. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Oh, I got one more What about Dak? Dak's an interesting case study because he's going to be asking for big time money. So to me, with my criteria, if they have investments along the line of scrimmage, which by the way, it looks like they're going to be losing their starting left tackle, Tyron Smith, and you've got Dak, I think you have to invest more in helping elevate Dak as a player and getting more weapons outside of just CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson. So that's what I'll say about Dak. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned. I look to keep the channel very active. So thanks again, and be on the lookout for the next episode.